So this is our 29th investor call, and we have a great agenda for today. I'll cover a brief introduction, and then we have Ryan to talk about our values. Then I'll cover the investments that we made last month. We then have a special guest, Jim Mellon, to talk about longevity and clean meats. And then we have Ryan and Nick to talk about space, and we'll finish off with Q&A. But just a brief note, this call will be recorded for those that couldn't make it. So a bit of background on the investor group. So it was formed in early 2019 by a handful of active angel investors that had access to blockbuster deals, but couldn't fill all of the allocations for those deals. And now we're over 220 investors from over 20 countries. And here's some of the investments that we've made. Companies like Juvenescence, Relativity Space, Volumetric, Oncogenics, Robinhood, and SpaceX. And we aim to continue to invest in great companies. And Ryan to talk a little more on our values.
Thank you, Kingsley. Welcome, everyone. Again, my name is Ryan Kriser. I'm running allocations with Kingsley, and I also run my own family office called Helios Capital. Just want to say that we're blessed and fortunate to have what I consider some of the best values of any investment group that's out there today. The ability for us to have so many different people with so many different domain expertise and contributions from different areas, I think really adds to our collective growth and makes us one of the best investor groups in the world. So I'm just, I'm proud that we have these and looking forward to growing with you all.
Thank you, Ryan. And here are our admins. We have a strong team of investors. So myself, Ryan, Winslow, Ben, Guillaume, Aditya, and Simon. And here's a recap of some of the investments that we made last month. We invested in Ashvata, so I think Chamath came into that deal as well. We invested in Heyman, Hong Kong dollar 200x short fund, and we got into that deal before it hit the headlines. So thanks again, Winslow, for bringing that deal. And we also invested in CapDesk, so the cap table management software for European startups. And without further ado, I'll introduce Jim Mellon. So he's a co-investor and friend. He's a fantastic investor, and I'm sure all of us can learn from him. Over to you, Jim.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can see me. Oh, you can see my table in the Isle of Man. I've got to do something about the camera. Okay, now you can see me. After 15 weeks in lockdown in the Isle of Man. I'm very grateful to Kingsley and Ryan and everyone for inviting me on today. I've got my colleague Anthony Chow, who's going to put up some slides. And I'm going to quickly gallop through the two meta theme areas that I'm particularly interested. One is longevity, represented by the company Juvenescence that you've invested in, or some of you invested in. And the other is the clean meat area, which Anthony actually heads up on our behalf. We've got about $50 million invested in that area. And I am using this lockdown period to write a book about the subject. And the book is called Moore's Law, which is a riff on the famous Moore's Law that you're all familiar with. And it's about the development of meat alternatives, including plant-based meats, but more importantly, cell-cultured meats, which we hope will correspond in terms of price reduction and scale upsurge in the same way with Moore's Law, so hence Moore's Law. So these are the three great big themes that I think that everyone should have in their portfolios. Forget about what happens short-term in the markets, although I know it's very hard to do that. But if you have some of this long-term, I think you'll do very well because it plays to the zeitgeist of our times and it plays to necessary changes that we need to make. And all of those are linked together. Now we know that COVID-19, the pandemic that came out of almost nowhere and has slammed the world a bit like a side rugby tackle, is a disease that affects older people. And if you're under 70, your chances of dying of COVID-19 are very remote. This is what and a gerolavic infection. I worked out what gerophilic means. It loves old people. And gerolavic, it also hates old people. That's absolutely true. So building resilience into elderly cohorts is a key part of what Juvenescence is trying to do as a company. And it plays very well into the current situation, because there will be another pandemic. We don't know whether that will be an antimicrobial pandemic, which I can assure you will be a lot worse than the current one that they're experiencing, which would be the result of the food supply again, but this time because too many antibiotics have been used in farm animals, and therefore we become antibiotic resistance to bacterial infection, or whether it's going to be another of these zoonotic infections that have come out largely of agricultural malpractice in China. But we do know that another one is going to come. And but on the good side, there is the fact that we have a remarkable advance in science going on. A lot of it is heavy paddling under the water that's not well seen by the majority of the population, and hence the opportunities in biotech and particularly in the longevity science that we are trying to take advantage of at the moment. But I want to demonstrate this by just showing you this quick slide of the two books that I've written in the last 7 years. One is called Cracking the Code, and it was about biotech as it then was in 2012. It's only 8 years ago. And the most recent one, Juvenescence, which actually was published in beginning of 2018 rather than 2019, but it's been updated, is on the subject of the science of longevity. Now, since Cracking the Code was published, there have been many remarkable things happening in biotech, of which most are not well known to the general public or the investing public. One would be the use of artificial intelligence for the development of novel compounds, thereby accelerating the process of drug discovery and reducing the cost of producing a novel drug. And it is possible to produce drugs now that are much cheaper than most people think drugs cost to develop. I'll give you an example. The company, the three founders of Juvenescence started exactly 5 years ago. Biohaven has now got a drug on the market after less than 5 years of development. And the $3 million that the three of us put in to buy half of that company 5 years ago, the market valuation of Biohaven is now about $4.5 billion US on the New York Stock Exchange. So it is possible to accelerate the process of drug development. And the tools that we have available at Juvenescence now, which Biohaven didn't have available, including AI, will allow us to perhaps accelerate that process even more as we roll out our INDs in the next 2 or 3 years. The second thing that happened in the last 7 years was the development of cancer immunotherapy. And we all know people who suffer or have suffered from cancer, and we know that some of the new therapies are working extremely well, and notably the immunotherapies, which did not exist 7 years ago when I wrote my book, Cracking the Code. Next year, that industry will be about $200 billion US in sales, making up a very large part of the cancer standard of care treatments, and having a biblical effect in some forms of cancer. It didn't exist 7 years ago. Likewise, the cure for hepatitis C didn't exist 7 years ago. And the papers on CRISPR had just been published. And as you know, there have been huge developments around CRISPR and the creation of multi-billion-dollar companies like CRISPR itself, CRISPR Therapeutics or Editas. So a lot has happened in the last 7 years. And I'm pretty convinced, notwithstanding this pandemic, which is the response to it has been almost medieval in the early stages at least, that the science that's going on at the moment will astonish us all over the next 7 years. And some of that science relates to human health span, which is the period in which we are ill towards the end of our lives, and bearing in mind that the average person who dies of COVID-19 in this country, in the UK, is over 80 and has 3.5 comorbidities. If we can reduce the number of comorbidities that people have in the latter part of their lives, we improve their chances of survival from respiratory tract infections, from pandemics, and from all sorts of other nasties that might come along. We know that we're more susceptible to disease as we get older, and we know that it's possible to boost the immune system. I don't just mean boost the immune system by taking vitamin D and zinc and supplements and so forth, although they are very important, and doing exercise and eating relatively healthily and moderating consumption of bad things. We know that that will help you to boost your immune system, but there are drugs out there, either in development or available now, that can be repurposed to produce a immune resilience benefit to the elderly population. And it's those sort of drugs that we are working on. Not only drugs, but also therapeutic approaches, including organ regeneration, and in particular, the organ that creates our T cells, which is the thymus. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. We know that there's been a severe decline in, or there is an age-related decline in health resilience, which I just said. So next slide again. And we know that at the same time as this has happened, COVID-19, the science of longevity has undercover almost been rapidly evolving. First of all, it was discovered that the human genome was unveiled and then has gradually been read more effectively as the last 20 years have gone on, and pathways, key pathways related to aging have been identified. There are somewhere between 15 and 20 of them, and all of those appear to be malleable in animal and organism models to the point where mice, for instance, can be engineered to live or treated to live twice as long as their wild type counterparts in better health throughout their lives. And that science is now being applied to human beings. So there are trials going on at the moment in such things as senolytic drugs, and I'll demonstrate senolytic drugs to you in a second, which remove senescent cells in the body. There are trials related to proteins in young blood introduced into older organisms, and there are such things as work going on in improving telomerase, i.e. the activity of telomeres, which are the caps at the end of your chromosomes that erode as cells divide, and of course, organ regeneration that I mentioned earlier on. There's a lot going on. There are some golden drugs that have been discovered. There are some golden therapies that have been discovered, and some of those will appear in humans over the next 10 years. The point at Juvenescence is we don't know exactly what's going to work, and no one does, but we know that something's going to work. So we have in our portfolio, if you want to call it that, 12 projects in which we are the only or lead investor, and where we work with the scientist entrepreneurs to produce drugs that might come to the market and therapies that might come to the market relatively quickly. But we are still at the Pasteur end of this process. We are still at the primitive end. It's like the dial-up phase of the internet, and hence the opportunity to make a very large amount of money as we discover and introduce new therapies onto the market over the subsequent years. So here's just one example. This is not a product from Juvenescence, but we do have a senolytic drug in development. This is a product from the Buck Institute, which is now being trialed by a company called Unity that you may have heard of, which is listed in America. And the general idea here is to give elderly mice a treatment with a one-off treatment with a drug that removes so-called senescent cells. As we get older, we get more and more senescent cells. They're cells that are somewhere between healthy functioning and apoptosis or programmed death. Those senescent cells cause a secretory phenomenon known as SAS. That SAS causes really a sort of infection around surrounding tissue, and the frailty that we see in elderly individuals, the lack of robustness, things like age-related macular degeneration or osteoarthritis, are all caused by the buildup of senescent cells. So the general idea is you remove the senescent cells and what happens? So here in this slide here, you have at the bottom the same mouse that's being treated at the age of about 95 equivalent mouse, human equivalent, and before the treatment above. And before the treatment, you can see that he or she has all the features of a very elderly animal. Can't see, it's got cancer, can't walk properly. And within 6 weeks, it goes back to being a middle-aged mouse, and it lives typically about 35% longer than a mouse that's not treated. So quite remarkable stuff happening. And of course, it doesn't necessarily translate from mice into men, but there is a very good chance that some of this will work in human beings, and hence the excitement around the stuff that Juvenescence and others are doing in the field. I'll give you another example of a company that we work very closely with. We own about half of this company. In the next month or so, this company will be in its first phase 2 trial. Phase 2, as you know, is the second of the 3 phases to get a drug onto the market, or a therapy onto the market in the United States. This is a US company out of the University of Pittsburgh, and it's going straight into a phase 2 with the approval of the FDA. This is quite remarkable, because normally products have to go into a phase 1, which is a safety trial, but because there's an unmet medical need in this particular instance, and because you can't use this system in healthy patients, it goes straight into sick patients in a phase 2. So in a relatively short space of time, within a year or so, we will know whether this is working or not. And this is basically a system where we take hepatocytes and we put them into lymph nodes in the body. We have plenty of lymph nodes. We put them adjacent, in the first instance, next to a failing liver. And there are plenty of people in the world who have failing livers and who will not find a liver transplant that matches. And there are just not enough livers out there, and liver transplants are extremely expensive, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea is to grow a brand new liver over time using this lysogenesis technique. About 1,000 animals have now been tested with this, and not one of them has failed in the test. So every single one of them has grown or developed an adjacent liver to the failing liver, the liver having been injured in some way or another to mimic liver disease in humans. And the really exciting bit about this is, of course, that if it works in the liver, it can work in other organs as well. And the thymus is where your T cells are developed, as I mentioned earlier on, and the B cells are matured, so they constitute a big part of your immune system. And if we can regrow the thymus, then obviously at least part of the immune system can be regenerated. And those thymus trials are going on in animals at the moment. And we're also trialing, or Lygenesis is trialing this system in the pancreas as well for the treatment of diabetes. So this is a super exciting area. This is one of our 12 projects. And it's a project that I have very high hopes for. And as I said, it will be in humans very soon, within the next month or so, which is quite remarkable considering that we only started this company, Juvenescence, 2 years ago, and Lygenesis we funded for about 50%, again with $3 million when Juvenescence started. So, the speed of this thing is quite remarkable, and we're super excited about what we're doing. So as I said, we're at the dawn of the internet. There'll be a lot of failures, there'll be a lot of trials, tribulations, a lot of money will be burnt in some areas. We hope not to burn too much money. We've raised in Juvenescence $170 million in the last 2 years, and we will raise, we hope, between 100 and 150 million on this Series C, and then at the end of next year, which is behind schedule, but largely because we've raised so much money privately, we'll take the company public. And if anything works in longevity, you have to believe that this will be the biggest stock market event in the history of the world. It'll outpace anything, including the Dutch tulip bulb craze, the Bitcoin craze, the cannabis craze, because everyone wants to live a longer life, and almost everyone wants to live a longer life in a healthier condition. And this is what the mission statement of Juvenescence is. Juvenescence is not a fund. It doesn't levy any fees or performance fees. And of the $170 million, the three principals have put in $35 million in cash on exactly the same terms as all other investors at every round. And we have, along with Kingsley and others who are on this call, we have a sovereign wealth investor, we have some large biotech investors now, some big prominent technology family offices, a good list of investors, and the company is taking shape. We still have about $80 million left on the balance sheet, but we will hope to supplement that before too long with another $100 to $150 million. And of course, rich people, I guess everyone on this call is relatively wealthy. Friends of Kingsley, you must be. And so you're prepared to spend apparently a large, according to UBS, a large part of your net worth on 10 years of extra healthy life. And I can see why a lot of people would be prepared to do this, but ultimately this will be available to everyone because the period of commercial exploitation of drugs and therapies is generally only about 10 years. And after that, it becomes generic and everyone can buy these products at relatively low cost. Actually, no, quickly, I'll just go on to clean meat. We know that these pandemics come from poor agricultural practices out of China, the so-called zoonotic diseases that have plagued the world, and plague is the right word, in the last 20 years or so. So finding a different way of producing food would be a very good thing. And this is what's happening at the moment. I mean, I think everyone here will be familiar with Beyond Meat, Impossible Burger, and so forth. These are products that are made with plants. They seek to mimic what you might call real meat. And the benefits of those are very considerable. About 1/6 of all emissions in the world come from the farming of animals. A very large part of the land mass is used to produce farmed animals. A very large number of animals are produced in intensive conditions, including with antibiotics and hormones. And if you're an animal lover like I am, they're produced in generally cruel conditions. And you know, there are all sorts of benefits for humans and for the environment if we could reduce the number of farmed animals. So the first wave of clean meat is the plant-based meats. And in this pandemic, two things have happened. One, well, actually three things have happened. One is that the slaughterhouses in the United States and now in Germany, I read today, have had huge interruptions at the cost in the United States of about $20 billion to the meat industry, because the workers work in close proximity and they work in very cold conditions where the pandemic can, or the virus can spread more readily. Second thing is that people are sitting at home much more often. They're cooking at home, prepared to try new things out. And the third is that the insipid veggie burgers of 20 years ago have been replaced by products that are much more palatable, much more like the burgers that people are used to, or the chicken breasts that people are used to, the breaded chicken breasts or fried chicken breasts that people are used to, both in taste, mouthfeel, texture, and they're getting down there in price as well. And so you have this plant-based stuff that is taking off very quickly. It's still very small as a percentage of overall meat sales in the United States, which is the world leader in this area. It's about 1% of conventional meat sales. It's growing about 6 times more rapidly than conventional meat. And no doubt at some point, it will represent a much higher percentage of the market as consumers recognize the, not just the environmental impact, but also the health benefits of eating this sort of stuff over conventional meat. But becoming behind that, we have, of course, the cell agricultural business, which is developing extremely quickly. And you can see here, actually, just as a by the by, you can see the number of epidemics that have occurred in the last 20 years, both avian, swine-related, possibly bat-related out of Wuhan, but it's all malpractice in agriculture that's led to the situation that we find ourselves in today. So something has to be done to improve the food supply, and that's what this new industry is doing, which is a phenomenal industry. It's linked to the environment, it's linked to longevity, and of course it's in itself a very disruptive industry. So if we can disrupt this industry, this amount of land in the United States would potentially become free. That would be fantastic for housing, and in this country, in the UK, even better. It would be fantastic from the point of view of food security. In this country, we import half of our protein. We could potentially make all of the protein in the UK. We would be able to engineer into these foods some very positive things, and we would avoid the waste and cruelty that's associated with growing animals in farm conditions. And it's not just about meat. There are plenty of foods that can be disrupted and other products that can be disrupted in this area. So in a nutshell, cell ag is where you take basically a biotech process, you amplify stem cells or fibroblasts, and you grow them in a bioreactor. You introduce them to a media, which is effectively a form of food, and they multiply, and then they differentiate into what you want them to differentiate into. And there are about 50 companies engaged in this area at the moment around the world. There are none, as far as I'm aware, that are public, but there will be some public ones. And most of them have produced a demonstration product. In other words, they've produced something that can be tasted. Scale is their big issue, and the cost of the growth factors that go into the medium and the cost of the medium are other issues that need to be addressed. But generally speaking, this industry is coming together very quickly. There's quite a lot of money coming into it, and all sorts of areas are going to be disrupted. So to give you an example, we are an investor in a company called Legendary. It's based in Germany. It's going to produce a cheese which will be identical in taste and texture to regular mozzarella, but it will be produced entirely through a fermentation and cellular process. We are also an investor in a company called Vitro Labs. That Vitro Labs makes and has made a leather that is exactly equivalent to leather that you would get off a cow, but it's made by a cellular process. And the big fashion houses, Kering and Louis Vuitton, are both buyers of their product. And the great thing about that is at the moment, the size of the piece of leather is dictated by the size of the cow. This can be produced or will be produced in almost infinite sizes, and eventually it will be cheaper than the rather horrible way in which they produce leather at the moment, involving tanning, which is a very polluting industry. And of course, there are lots of companies that are going to be producing cultivated meats, ranging from beef to pork to chicken, and there's a race on at the moment, and all of them have different processes. All of them have different market potential. And then on top of that, you have fish, of course. Fish is now able to be made in a lab. A company called Blue Nalu out of San Diego is already producing small sampling sizes of its mahi-mahi and tuna. And in due course, those companies will be produce these foods at massive scale. And of course, as the scale improves, the cost comes down, and I call this the griddle parity effect. So as some of you will know from investments in renewable energy, everything is about trying to get down to grid parity, which means competing with renewables to bring down the price of the product, or in that case, electricity, to the same level as the conventional producers. And the same goes with cell agricultural products. In about 8 years, it's estimated that we will be at griddle parity in some of these products. And at that stage, this will be a hugely disruptive industry. And if you doubt that, let me just point you to the growth of plant-based milk products in the United States. They've grown so much that the two biggest producers of milk in the US have, in a relatively recent past, gone bankrupt. They now have at least 15% of the market by volume, and things like almond milk, soy milk, and so forth, as you know, are in every coffee shop everywhere in the world. And they had less than 0.5% market share just 10 years ago. So the potential is absolutely vast. The need for this food is incredible, both from an environmental point of view and also from a let's stop the pandemic point of view, because as I said, everything that has hit us in the last 20 years has come out of agricultural malpractice. And if there are any future pandemics, they will come out of agricultural malpractice. So we need to advance, we need to put more money into this area. We need to develop this area as quickly as we can. And this, alongside longevity, is the major focus of my attention and Auntie's attention at the moment. And of course, just as with longevity, just as with the internet in the 1980s and early 1990s, the money is beginning to come in. There are very large amounts of money coming into this area, you know, almost like a hockey curve, and large amounts coming into the plant-based food industry as well. So already Impossible has raised $500 million this year. Live Kindly has raised $200 million this year. And as you can see, some of the cell ag companies are beginning to raise serious amounts of money as well, including Memphis Meats, which raised $161 million in January of this year. And there will be a lot more coming. So watch this space. And thank you for your interest. I'm sorry that the slides took a little bit longer than expected. We haven't obviously worked out our way to turn them over fast enough, but I appreciate Kingsley and colleagues inviting me and Anthony onto this webinar, and I hope it was of interest to your audience.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jim. A really fantastic presentation, great analysis and insight. And many of us are investors in Juvenescence, and we also have a number of clean meat investors in the group as well. And we are looking at a number of longevity companies to invest in and clean meat companies. And we hope to continue to co-invest with you over the coming decades.
Well, if I live that long, you're very welcome to invest in me in anything at all. But I've got a very big self-interest in this Juvenescence, apart from you know, trying to help my elderly parents and others. I want to help myself to live a long life and to look as youthful as you, Kingsley.
Thank you. Agreed. So we'll save maybe just 5 minutes for Q&A. I think we had 3 questions. First question was, what are the steps to mass produce clean meat?
Well, there are 2 areas, as I mentioned. There's the plant-based one, which is typically made with extruder technology that was developed out of General Mills. That is being refined all the time and improved. And actually, the production of, although these guys have been working 24 hours a day during the pandemic, the production has kept pace, generally speaking, with demand. So Beyond Meat, which is the market leader, was expected by Jefferies, the big US investment bank, to have $1 billion in sales by 2030. It will be tracking $1 billion a year in sales by the end of this year. So its scale is something that they're beginning to deal with. They're opening up new plants. They have just opened a new plant in Holland. In fact, in the last couple of weeks, they've opened a new plant in Holland. And so scale in that area, I think, is, I'm not going to say it's easy, because it's not, but it's highly manageable, and they've demonstrated they're able to do it. In terms of cell ag, everything will come down to 3 issues. One is the ability to replace very expensive growth factors, which allow the proliferation of the cells. So basically what happens is that because they're not using dead animals in the process of producing this for obvious reasons, they take a cell sample out, a biopsy out of a cow, let's say. They then take the stem cells from that and amplify those stem cells, and then they force the differentiation. In order to do that, you need these growth factors, and the growth factors from various companies vary, but they're super expensive, and they form by far the biggest part of the cost of the production of cell meat as we know it now. Those growth factors are going to become cheaper, and the media, which is the nutrients, which are sort of amino acids and salts and vitamins and so forth that go in to feed the cells to produce the biomass that then becomes the meat that we will eventually eat, will also come down in price. And in fact, there are people, this is an incredible situation. There are people working in Finland and in America who are taking literally air and carbon dioxide using cheap energy to produce proteins from effectively thin air. And it's worth looking up this company, Solar Foods, if you're interested, because I think it's just absolutely fascinating. And that protein sludge that comes out of that process may well form the media that produces cell ag meat. So the cost will come down. The cost will come down, and also the scale will improve. So at the moment, you know, you might get a 1 liter or 5 liter bioreactor worth of cell ag meat, but in 2 or 3 years' time, you'll be looking at 20,000 liters. And the production process, by the way, of this meat is about 2 weeks. So rather than the 2 or 3 years it takes to fatten up a cow to produce cow meat, and the huge inefficiency in producing that cow meat, the amount of water, the amount of protein that goes into the cow to produce beef protein is incredibly inefficient. This will be able to be done in 2 weeks relative to 2.5 years. So it's going to be a phenomenal industry. And what Anthony's job is to find the winners in this industry, and for us to invest in them and then work with those companies to develop them. I think that all of these companies, or most of them, will be bought by the big agricultural companies like ConAgra, Unilever, or food companies like Nestle, Kellogg's, and so forth in due course, because they know they've got to get into this area. So that was a bit of a long way around answering that one question. Sorry.
That's fine. Thank you, Jim, for that. Last question, I think, is why are traditional investors overlooking longevity?
I don't think they are necessarily. It depends what you mean by traditional investors, but you know, people have always been skeptical about anything to do with longevity because nothing's worked for the last 20,000 years, right? So there've been a lot of promises of the elixir of youth. You've had people 30 years ago saying that we were on the cusp of a longevity revolution. But now we really do have the potential to keep people alive longer and in better health. And, you know, but there's a big mindset about, you know, I'm used to being born, learning, earning, retiring, and expiring as being my trajectory of life, and living to about 85. That's what most people think is going to happen to them. In fact, with the current technologies, forget about any future technologies, it's entirely possible that half the people on this call will live to 110 to 120, just using what we have at the moment and using the better and healthier foods that and supplements and stuff that are available to us now. So we're already at the point of a serious expansion in longevity. It may not look like it right now, but it's about to happen. When the additional stuff starts happening, like gene therapies, microbiome technologies, the organ regeneration, when all that starts to happen, you'll see people beginning to think that maybe they might live, or some of their friends might live to 130 or 140. And then that's when the investment market goes mad. And we're about 1 or 2 years away from that, I think. But, you know, we're trying to position ourselves as a diversified portfolio of prospects, carefully curated by particularly Dec Dugan, who's one of our 3 partners, who's got a 70% record of success from mouse to man, and his long career as the head of drug development at Pfizer, and then the CEO of Amarin, and now the chairman of Biohaven, and also the chief medical officer of Juvenescence. So we're going to give it a very good shot. We've got a really good veteran team of people and a very good network in the longevity area. I'm sure that we'll have 1 or 2 great results from our portfolio, and that will be enough to generate super sensational returns for you and your other investors in Juvenescence. And then look to the clean meat area as being something of interest. And if you are interested in clean meat, do get in touch with Anthony, who is the boss of that company. It's a small listed company. I'm the biggest shareholder of it. I think that's a great way to get exposure to the clean meat area as well. As far as I'm aware, it's the only listed investment company anywhere in the world that covers this area.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jim. And
thank you very much. And thank you everyone for listening. I really appreciate it. And thanks, Kingsley. See you soon, I hope.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. We're all very bullish about both juvenescence and agronomics. And thank you again, Jim, for your insights. Go ahead.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks. We'll finish off with some space updates. So we have Ryan and Nick. I'm just conscious we are running a bit over time, but this was a big deal in the group. And fortunately, we do have Ryan and Nick to talk about some space updates.
Thank you, Kingsley. And again, really honored to be here again today, everyone. As we're listening to Jim, it got me thinking a lot of the intersections and the themes that he was talking about with this next area of investment that we're going to be touching on, which is space. Themes like longevity and sustainability when it comes to proteins and food production. We're going to need to figure out how to become self-sustaining ecosystems within the space industry. When we're talking about building space stations and going to the moon and going to Mars, a lot of these technologies that Jim was mentioning today are going to be able to are going to be applied to the fast-growing space industry that we see today. As you can tell from my background, space is my passion and one of my my greater investment themes that I've been investing in over the years. So I know quite a bit about the industry, and I know quite a bit of contacts throughout the industry. Something that we're truly excited about that I want to talk about today is Nicholas and we have joined forces to form a mega SPV into a company called Axiom Space. Now, as you all saw 2 weeks ago, SpaceX launched their first commercial crewed rocket to the International Space Station. You might think of SpaceX and Blue Origin as the transcontinental railroad to space. And this company, Axiom, that we're investing in is essentially going to be holding the real estate in space, eventually taking over for the International Space Station. I'm excited for this one. I have nothing but fantastic things to say about the team, and I respect them greatly, and they've all had some of the best experience in the industry. I'm not going to say too much more. I'm going to let Nicholas touch a little bit more on the company and this investment. So without further ado, I'm pleased to present Nicholas, who's the founding partner of the Venture Collective. Nicholas, pleasure.
Hey, everyone. Hey, thanks so much, Ryan. And yeah, that was a really great talk from Jim. I really enjoyed it, and it was kind of blew my mind when on one of the slides he mentioned Vitro Labs, which is one of my first. In fact, I think it was my first ever angel check. So it's a very small world, but yeah, no, really excited about this kind of team up between us and what we're doing in Axiom. It's a huge opportunity, and it's a very rare example of something that is kind of truly monopolistic in its sense. So no, super excited there, and happy to give a bit of context. Axiom Space effectively have kind of two parts to their business model. Right now, they are working with the current International Space Station and taking it from what has historically been a kind of not-for-profit initiative to something that is, effectively commercialized. So, for a bit of background and context, as many people here will know, the ISS obviously, was one of the biggest kind of peacetime undertakings of our generation, and also was, I think, the single biggest expense for a single object ever built in history. And the ISS represents a lot of kind of the peacetime initiatives that exist in this world. And so this project's particularly unique in the sense that Axiom have this unique opportunity here to take over that running, but also to drive it from something that is, well, some would say is a kind of a money sink right now. So a couple of billion a year in just maintenance expenses for the space station, but actually turn it into something that generates profit and commercial ability, which I think is really transformational and really kind of makes a big leap in the kind of space sector as a whole, because there's lots of people trying to build crazy innovations in the rocket space and in satellites and a whole other heap of different things there. But actually having a piece of real estate that is commercial in space is kind of a next iteration of what is historically been very government driven. And so of course a big part of this is going to be government driven, but actually a large part of this is opening up to private individuals who want to go and spend 20, 30, 60 days in space, medical research, telecoms companies, anyone who wants a base in space will be able to use Axiom as their base going forwards. For the first kind of 3-4 years, it's going to be in the existing station. But Thales Alenia are undertaking on building the new station, which will be completely privately held and will, open space up from being something that's dominated by 4 or 5 nations to being something that, is open to a whole heap of different countries who want to get involved in that initiative and really kind of democratize that. So, nothing better than a great team. The CEO of the company is, the former head of the ISS, and the chairman, ran one of the biggest astronaut training companies in the US, which he sold for a sizable amount. And so we really back them, and it's super exciting to see so much participation from this group. And we've done, a pretty sizable 2.28 mil SPV here, which is great. And there was actually demand for far more. So we're very lucky to be on this journey, and also with obviously Megan from Space Fund as well. And there's a whole group of people here who will be rooting for Axiom. So really excited there. So thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Nicholas. Appreciate it.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Ryan and Nick, and really grateful for bringing such a fantastic deal to the group.
No problem at all.
So we covered today, brief introduction. Ryan covered the values. Our investments last month, we had Jim to talk about longevity and clean meats, and Ryan and Nick to talk about space. I understand we're running a bit over time, but Ryan and I will stay on for any questions you may have. But otherwise, we'll see you all in the Slack, and our next call is in about 2 weeks. But thank you all for joining.
Thank you, everyone. Great to see everyone again today.
Fantastic. So if anyone has any questions about any of the deals in the group, maybe it's how to post a deal, maybe it's how to invest in a deal, we're happy to answer any questions. Okay, great. Well, I think understand we're running a bit over time, so let's leave any questions for the call in 2 weeks, but feel free to message us in the Slack.